A very good morning to you. Welcome to Morning Shot. I'm Lynlee. If you're an orchid lover or even a budding gardener, it's time to listen up. Singapore is playing host to the 14th edition of the Asia Pacific Orchid Conference this year. From now till this weekend, the Singapore Expo has been transformed into an orchid marketplace featuring some of the region's most special orchid varieties and dazzling pots of competition orchids. Experts from around the globe are also gathered for this prestigious event that's jointly organized by the National Parks Board and the Orchid Society of Southeast Asia to share their insights on orchid hybridization and conservation. For more, we're joined by Dr. Gillian Khew, Center Director for Genomics and Micropropagation, Singapore Botanic Gardens. Morning, Dr. Khew.
Good morning. Thank you for having us here.
We also have with us Dr. Tan Puay Yok, Group Director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens.
Good morning. Yeah.
Now, if you can imagine, our studio is just booming with vibrancy from the orchids that our guests brought in this morning. Before we get to the orchids in the studio, Dr. Tan, Singapore's national flower is an orchid called the Vanda Miss Joaquim, and we're also known for our orchid diplomacy, basically. World leaders that visit Singapore would usually get an orchid hybrid named after them as a gesture of friendship to promote goodwill between Singapore and other countries. Help us understand here, why are orchids accorded such a high standing?
Indeed. So this is the VIP orchid program of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and orchids are particularly suitable for this purpose for a couple of reasons. And the first is that orchids has been cultivated by different cultures for a couple of thousand years. So they are widely admired, they are understood, and people appreciate them for their beauty. Second reason is that orchids comes in all kinds of size, color, shape. There's a big diversity of them. So it's relatively easy to cross the orchids and produce a new hybrid that is special. And the third reason must be that it's related to our national flower. So it's a symbolic gift and a good one from Singapore.
Talking about some hybrids, right? Could you briefly share some examples of these hybrids?
Yeah, there are about 200 of them that have named after VIPs or dignitaries. It's hard to pick a winner. My personal favorite is Princess Diana, Dendrobium Princess Diana.
Okay.
It's lovely because it's white and there's a tinge of pink in the center, and it reflects the elegance.
Nice.
The other one I would say is Paravanda Nelson Mandela. We named after him when he visited Singapore in 1997, and that's special because the flower has different colors of orange with mainly yellow and green that is similar to the national colors of South Africa. So that's special, and we had this honor to name it after a giant in history.
Okay, our guests have brought in some orchids into the studio this morning. So, Dr. Khew, let's get you to quickly take us through some of the orchids we have in front of us, some of which can be found in Singapore.
Yes, so I've brought in two orchids that are native to Singapore that are also new to science, which means that we did not know about them previously, and they were recently found and described as new species. And these two were found in Singapore in our nature reserves. The one that I'm holding right now is called Nervilius singaporensis. It was named for Singapore. It was found in 2019 in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. The other one that I have over here is called Cladaria leontocampus. Leontocampus is Greek for Malayan, and it was found only recently, and it was named and published this year.
If you could, for the benefit of our listeners, describe this orchid that's in a terrarium currently.
Yes, so this orchid in the terrarium, which is Cladaria leontocampus, has very soft leaves and a little bit floppy as well. It tends to grow as stems on the forest floor, so it scrambles on the forest floor, and then it climbs up trees, and that's when it flowers, when it gets close enough to a suitable light source. The flowers, for the inflorescence, it can last 1 year.
Wow.
But then the flowers open sequentially, and each flower lasts about 3 to 4 days. And the flowers are yellow in color.
Do they flower easily?
They do flower easily as long as you give them a good light source, but then you need to keep the humidity up because any plant that grows in a forest is used to a higher humidity than our urban environment.
And I see this terrarium has a plug, which
Yeah.
means that there's got to be some light for the orchids as well.
Yes, that's correct. So there's an LED light
Mhm.
connected to this, as well as ventilation.
I see. Okay. Dr. Tan, we talked about the social and economic history of orchids earlier, but what kind of role do orchids play in the natural ecosystem? Perhaps you can use the orchids we have in the studio this morning as examples.
Yep, sure. So orchids is a very big family of plants. There are about 25 to 30,000 species alone, and that represents about 10% of all plants that are known to man. So it's a big group of plants. And we say that they are highly advanced in evolution terms, meaning that they have developed structures to allow them to survive in an environment. So they're intimately associated with the kind of environment they live in. So for instance, you can see in this one, this is a tiny
It's a
one.
tiny one, yes.
And it has yellow flowers that are relatively large, and that's primarily, I guess, to attract pollinators to it. So
What's
they
it called?
can. This is called Ericina pusilla.
Mhm.
It's a lovely plant.
Mhm.
Now, this, on the other hand, is a big one that is also called the deer antler orchid because the flower spikes
I
resember
see.
deer antler.
I see.
And so orchids come in a great diversity of forms, shapes, and they are intimately associated with the environment. So they are also a very good indicator of the quality of the environment, whether or not the environment is suitable for their growth. This is an indicator species for that. Yeah.
Talking about growth, Dr. Khew, could you weigh in on how climate change is impacting the survival of orchid species in the wild?
Yes, I would say that we have all personally experienced or witnessed the effects of climate change, whether it is the warming up of our environment or seeing forest fires on the news. And the thing about animals and humans is that we can move to a more comfortable environment if we need to, but plants just can't get up and walk away. So when forest fires happen, the plants in the forest get destroyed along with it, including orchids. Orchids are also 70% of tropical orchids are tree-dwelling orchids, which means they live on trees. And so the moment trees are felled, could be through microbursts, or it could be destroyed by forest fires, then the orchids go with them as well. And in addition, when there are temperature changes, these affect rain patterns, and it affects flowering of the plants and reproduction. It also might cause pollinators to move away. And so even if plants can flower, but they don't get pollinated, then they can't reproduce as well. So there are very severe effects of climate change on our natural environment and on the survival of orchids.
That sounds really dismal. We understand that you've done quite a bit of orchid research. So could you elaborate on our local efforts in orchid breeding and how that benefits orchid conservation on a wider scale?
Okay, so in the orchid world, when we talk about breeding, we often refer to the crossing of two parent plants to create a hybrid. Usually, this has very little relevance to orchid conservation, which is the protection of wild species that we find in our forests. So the first step of conservation of wild species would, of course, be to do field surveys. We have to go out to the jungles to find the plants so that we know what's out there, and only when we know what's out there can we protect them. And the next step would be to describe them and to name them. And then after that, we can do some ex situ conservation through propagating these plants in the nurseries. We can store seeds of these plants, and we can also propagate them through tissue culture. And once we have them, we have a good population size, we can then reintroduce them to the wild again.
Okay, Dr. Tan, it is the second day of the Asia Pacific Orchid Conference. What are you hoping to achieve through this event? And can we expect interesting partnerships perhaps to further develop areas like orchid research, culture, and hybridization?
Yep. So today is the second day of the conference, and in fact, today's the theme of conference is conservation of orchids. So, like Gillian said, conservation is of prime importance for us to continue the survivability of this group of plants. And so, there's a wide range of topics are presented at the conference, including at the stage programs they have organized for experts to share with participants different topics on breeding, cultivation, and keeping your plants alive and getting them to flower. So it's going to be an exciting program for everyone over the next couple of days.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about how Gardens by the Bay and Botanic Gardens won some big honors at the event as well. There is this plant that resembles egg yolks.
Yep.
Tell us more about that.
Well, this is a species of plant orchid that's found in the Himalayas. This was a submission by Gardens by the Bay, and it looks like an egg yolk because of the very attractive patch of yellow that you see on the flower.
Yeah,
And if you look
seen the
from
pictures,
afar,
yes.
actually you also see that we call it a pine cone orchid because a
okay.
bunch of the inflorescence looks like a pine cone. So this is really
Okay.
interesting, but it only tends to flower when it has enough cold temperature exposure. So it grow outdoors, it can flower, but not in this kind of profusion of flowers that come up. Yeah.
Okay. So what other rare species can we expect at the conference?
Oh, well, we have a number of native orchids
Mhm.
that are on show at the conference, including this Phalaenopsis cornucervi that we brought in. We also have Cymbidium finlaysonianum. In addition to that, we have a genetically engineered orchid that is being
Wow.
shown by the Japanese.
Mhm.
And this is an orchid where they put in a blue gene.
That's right. I saw that one. Yes.
Yes,
in
and
the
genetically
paper, yeah.
engineered orchids are very rare because most of the time we produce orchids by crossing them using pollen on stigma, the traditional way by fertilization. It's very difficult to genetically modify orchids because they take a long time to regenerate.
Wow, exciting. I'm definitely going to pay a visit to Singapore Expo this weekend.
We hope
Thank
you do.
so much, Dr. Tan and Dr.
Thank
Khew, for
you.
joining us
Thank
today.
you. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Dr. Gillian Khew, Center Director for Genomics and Micropropagation, and Dr. Tan Puay Yok, Group Director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens. This is Morning Shot. Stay with Money FM 89.3.